Good evening, and welcome to Sleep Sanctuary, where calmness and imagination meet to guide you into a restful sleep. Take a moment to settle in. Let the weight of the day drift away, like snowflakes melting on your shoulders. Close your eyes, if you'd like, and imagine yourself in the heart of a quiet winter night. The world outside is hushed, the air crisp and sharp with the promise of snow. Somewhere, just at the edge of your hearing, a faint whistle calls out, a sound both familiar and otherworldly. Tonight, I want to tell you a story. A story of a train that only appears in winter, shrouded in mystery and cloaked in snow. It isn't marked on any map, and no ticket office sells its passage. It arrives at the stroke of midnight, as if summoned by the season itself. Some say it's a ghost train, others call it a dream. But I know better. I've ridden it. I've seen it with my own eyes. The first time I saw the train, it was on a night much like this one. Snow was falling steadily, blanketing the ground in silence. I had been walking aimlessly, seeking solace from a restlessness I couldn't quite name. The streets were empty, the world asleep. And then, through the swirling snow, I saw it, the faint glow of lanterns, the gleam of polished steel, the hiss of steam curling into the cold air. It seemed impossible, and yet there it was. A train parked at a station that didn't exist on any map. Its carriages were old but elegant, each window glowing with a warm, golden light. The sound of its engine was deep and steady, like a heartbeat in the winter night. Something about it called to me, though I couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the mystery of it, or the way it seemed to promise answers to questions I hadn't yet dared to ask. Without fully understanding why, I stepped closer, drawn by an invisible thread. What I didn't know then was that this train wasn't just a means of travel. It was something more, a bridge between what was and what could be. And so, with snow crunching beneath my boots and a sense of wonder in my heart, I stepped aboard the winter train at midnight. Before we continue our journey, let's take a moment to unwind. Close your eyes if you haven't already, and allow your body to sink into a state of calm. Feel the surface beneath you, supporting you effortlessly. Let the tension in your shoulders melt away, as though warmed by the soft glow of candlelight. Now, imagine yourself standing in the midst of a serene winter landscape. The snow beneath your feet is soft and powdery, each step leaving a gentle imprint. The air is crisp, carrying the faintest scent of pine, and as you exhale, you can see your breath curling like wisps of smoke into the cold air. Above you, the sky stretches endlessly, a deep velvet blue scattered with countless stars. Snowflakes drift slowly from the heavens, their descent graceful and unhurried. Take a deep breath in, filling your lungs with the pure, cool air. Hold it for a moment, then release, letting all your worries flow out with your exhale. Now, listen closely. In the distance, you hear the soft chime of a train whistle, carried on the winter breeze. The sound is faint yet clear, like a whisper calling to you. With each breath, the whistle grows nearer, its rhythm steady and soothing, blending with the natural hush of the snowy night. Feel your body grow lighter, as though the weight of the day is being lifted with each passing moment. Let your thoughts quiet, like footsteps fading into the snow. You are here, in this moment, safe and calm. Stay with this feeling of peace as long as you need, knowing the winter train is on its way, ready to guide us on a journey of stories and discovery. When you're ready, we'll board together. The train's whistle echoed once more, deep and resonant, pulling me from my thoughts. As I stood at the edge of the platform, staring at the weathered carriages, I felt a strange mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Snowflakes caught the warm glow of the train's lanterns, turning the air into a swirl of gold and silver. I took a deep breath, feeling the chill settle into my chest, and stepped forward. The train door opened with a soft creak, revealing a staircase that gleamed faintly, as though polished by time itself. I climbed aboard, my footsteps tentative. Inside, the air was warm and inviting, carrying the faint aroma of spiced cider and old wood. The walls were panelled with rich mahogany, and the flickering light of ornate sconces danced across velvet curtains. It was like stepping into another era, a place where time slowed and the cold outside couldn't reach. The carriage was empty at first glance, yet it didn't feel deserted. A quiet hum vibrated through the walls, as if the train itself was alive, aware of my presence. At the far end of the car, a figure emerged, a man in a tailored uniform with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets. He tipped his hat as he approached, his movement smooth and deliberate. "Welcome aboard," he said, his voice low and steady. "The winter train runs but once a year, and only for those who need it most." "Need it?" I asked, unsure of what he meant. The conductor smiled faintly, as though he'd heard the question countless times. "You'll understand soon enough," he replied. "For now, take a seat. The journey is just beginning." I moved further into the carriage, my fingers grazing the plush upholstery of the seats as I passed. Each seat seemed to hold its own story, its own weight. Finally, I chose one by the window, where I could watch the snow-draped world pass by. As the train lurched to life, I felt a subtle shift, as if the very air around me had changed. The view outside was blurred by the falling snow, but the gentle rocking of the train was soothing, like a cradle swaying in the night. I wasn't alone for long. One by one, passengers began to appear, stepping quietly into the carriage. There was an elderly woman clutching a small, leather-bound book, her eyes misty with memory. A middle-aged man with a face etched in sorrow sat 2 rows ahead of me, staring at his hands. A young woman with a bright scarf and a nervous energy settled near the door, her gaze darting between the window and the floor. None of us spoke, but there was an unspoken understanding among us. We were here for a reason, though none of us could yet say why. The conductor reappeared, moving silently through the aisle. As he passed each passenger, he nodded, as though acknowledging something only he could see. When he reached me, he paused. "Be ready," he said softly. "The stories you'll hear tonight are as much yours as they are theirs." I didn't know what he meant, but I nodded anyway, unable to shake the feeling that this journey was about to change everything. The train had settled into a soothing rhythm, the steady clack of its wheels blending with the muffled stillness of the snowy night outside. I found myself lulled into a calm, almost dreamlike state when the elderly woman seated across the aisle stirred. She had been silent for some time, her hands resting gently on the worn leather book she carried. Now, her fingers traced the cover as if drawing strength from its touch. She glanced toward me, her kind but weary eyes meeting mine. "You're new to the winter train," she said softly, her voice tinged with a warmth that seemed to defy the chill of the season. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I suppose I am," I finally replied. "I'm still not sure why I'm here." She smiled faintly, a knowing look passing over her face. "None of us are, at first. But the train has its reasons. It always does." I leaned forward slightly, curiosity overcoming my hesitation. "How did you come to be here?" She rested the book on her lap and gazed out the window, her expression softening. "It was many winters ago," she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I was young then, barely more than a girl. And in those days, I thought love was eternal, that it could weather any storm." Her fingers tightened around the book as she spoke, her gaze distant. "His name was Peter. We met on a day when the first snow of the season had fallen. He was charming, full of life, and he had this way of making the world seem brighter. We spent every winter together, building snowmen, sharing hot cocoa, and dreaming of the future." Her voice wavered, and she took a deep breath before continuing. "But life has a way of pulling people apart. He was offered an opportunity in another city, and I was too afraid to follow. I told myself it was for the best, that we'd find our way back to each other. But the winters passed, one after another, and I never saw him again." She opened the book, revealing pages filled with pressed flowers, faded photographs, and handwritten notes. "This is all I have left of him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every winter, I've carried the weight of what might have been. Regret, they call it. A wound that never quite heals." For a moment, the carriage was silent, the weight of her words settling over us like freshly fallen snow. But the train, she continued, her eyes brightening slightly, it's given me something I never thought I'd find, peace. It's shown me that love, even when it's lost, leaves its mark. And those marks, they shape us, teach us, remind us of what we're capable of feeling. I didn't know how to respond. Her story, though deeply personal, resonated with something buried within me. Before I could speak, she closed the book and smiled gently. The train has its reasons, she repeated, and it will reveal yours in time. With that, she leaned back in her seat, her eyes drifting shut. I sat quietly, staring out into the snowy night, her words lingering in my mind. The train's rhythm continued its gentle sway, as if cradling us in its timeless journey. Outside, the snowstorm thickened, a curtain of white wrapping the world in quiet solitude. I had barely begun to process the elderly woman's story when the middle-aged man seated a few rows ahead stirred. His expression, carved with sorrow, caught my attention. He seemed lost in thought, his hands clasped tightly together as if holding onto something invisible. He must have felt my gaze because he turned slightly, his tired eyes meeting mine. "You heard her story, didn't you?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. "Yes," I replied, unsure of what else to say. He nodded, as though expecting my answer. After a pause, he leaned back in his seat and spoke again. I wasn't planning to talk, but maybe it's time I did. I said nothing, sensing this wasn't a moment to interrupt. He exhaled deeply, his breath almost trembling, and began. "My name's Tom," he said, his voice low, the sound barely rising above the hum of the train. "And every winter, I'm reminded of the worst mistake of my life." He stared out the window, his reflection merging with the snowy landscape beyond. "Years ago, I had a best friend, Danny. We grew up together, spent our winters building forts in the snow, laughing till we couldn't breathe. We were like brothers." A faint smile touched his lips, but it quickly faded. Then came that one winter. We had a stupid fight. I don't even remember what it was about anymore, something small, meaningless. But I let my pride get the better of me. Weeks passed, then months. Neither of us reached out. I told myself he'd come around, that I didn't need to apologize. Tom's hands tightened into fists. That spring, Danny died in a car accident. Just like that, he was gone. And I never got the chance to make things right. The weight of his words settled heavily in the air. He closed his eyes for a moment, his face etched with regret. Every winter since, I've thought about him. About the words I should have said. About how different things might have been if I'd just swallowed my pride. I felt a lump form in my throat, the rawness of his confession cutting deeper than I expected. "Why are you here, on this train?" I asked gently. He hesitated, then looked down at his hands. "I think the train brought me here to remind me it's not too late, not entirely. Maybe I can't fix the past, but I can honor it. I can be better to the people I still have in my life. That's why I'm here. To finally learn how to let go of the guilt and move forward." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was filled with the echoes of his words, of his pain, and of the faint hope that shimmered beneath it. The train rumbled on, carrying us deeper into the night. I looked out at the snow-covered world, reflecting on my own regrets, wondering what lessons this journey still held for me. The train rocked gently as it carried us further into the snow-laden night. The warmth of the carriage and the soft glow of its lanterns created a cocoon of safety, a sharp contrast to the howling winter outside. I sat quietly, replaying the stories I'd heard, the elderly woman's regretful love and Tom's haunting guilt. The winter train seemed to collect fragments of sorrow and weave them into something that felt almost sacred. The young woman with the bright scarf shifted in her seat near the door. Her nervous energy hadn't escaped me earlier, and now, as she glanced toward me, I could see uncertainty flicker across her face. She hesitated, then stood, clutching her scarf as though it anchored her. Slowly, she approached, her footsteps soft on the plush carpet. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, her voice delicate but edged with determination. "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the seat across from me. She settled in, fidgeting slightly before meeting my gaze. "I've been watching you listen to everyone," she said. "And I feel like maybe it's time I spoke, too." I nodded, sensing the weight of her decision. "My name's Elena," she began, her fingers twisting the fringe of her scarf. "And this winter, it marks the anniversary of something I've never been able to forgive myself for." Her eyes dropped to her lap, and she took a deep breath before continuing. "I was a ballet dancer. It was my whole life, every practice, every performance. I lived for it. And I had this little sister, Sophie. She adored me, always wanted to come to my rehearsals, always wanted to dance with me. But I was so focused on myself back then. I thought I'd have all the time in the world to share those moments with her." Elena paused, her voice trembling. "One winter, Sophie begged me to take her to the park. She wanted to see the ice skaters. I had a rehearsal and told her no. I promised I'd take her the next weekend. But that next weekend never came." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Sophie got sick, so fast, so suddenly. She was gone before I could keep my promise. And I threw myself into dancing, trying to escape the guilt. But every winter, I remember her face, her excitement, and how I brushed her off like she didn't matter. I stopped dancing after that. It didn't feel right without her cheering me on. The room felt heavy, Elena's grief seeping into every corner. "So why are you here?" I asked gently, echoing the question I'd asked Tom. Elena managed a fragile smile. "I think I'm here to remember her without the guilt. To stop punishing myself for the time we didn't get and cherish the memories we did. Maybe even to find the courage to dance again, not for me this time, but for her." Her words hung in the air, delicate yet powerful. As the train carried us onward, I couldn't help but feel the threads of our stories intertwining, pulling us closer to something we didn't yet fully understand. The train continued its journey, weaving through the snowy expanse, its rhythmic hum a steady companion. Each story I'd heard stayed with me, layering themselves in my mind like the snow outside, Tom's regret, Elena's guilt, the elderly woman's bittersweet love. They had entrusted me with their truths, their unspoken pain, and in doing so, I felt my own burden stir, unresolved and waiting. The conductor reappeared, his polished shoes silent on the carpeted floor. He paused by my seat, his steady gaze meeting mine. "How are you finding the journey so far?" he asked, his voice calm but probing. "It's unlike anything I've ever experienced," I admitted. "These stories, they're so personal, yet they feel familiar somehow. As if I've lived pieces of them myself." He nodded, the corners of his mouth curving into the faintest smile. "That's the nature of the winter train. It shows us reflections of our own hearts in others' experiences. But it also invites us to uncover what we've buried within ourselves." I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, the train began to slow. The hum softened, and the world outside the window shifted. The snow seemed to part, revealing a frozen lake illuminated by moonlight. The train came to a gentle stop, and the conductor gestured toward the door. "It's time," he said. "For what?" "For you to take the next step." I hesitated, but found myself rising from my seat. The other passengers remained still, their faces calm as though they knew this moment wasn't for them. I stepped off the train and into the snow, the cold biting but oddly invigorating. The lake stretched out before me, its surface like a mirror reflecting the starry sky. At its center stood a lone figure cloaked in shadow, their features obscured. Something about them felt achingly familiar, as though I'd known them in another time or another life. I moved closer, my footsteps crunching in the snow. The figure turned, and as the moonlight touched their face, I felt my breath catch. It was me, but not as I was now. This version of me carried the weight of every mistake, every regret I had tried to forget. His eyes were tired, yet they held a quiet strength I hadn't seen in myself for years. He spoke, his voice identical to mine yet tinged with something deeper. "You've heard their stories, but what about your own? Why are you here?" The question struck like a gust of icy wind. I looked down at the frozen lake, its surface shimmering with memories, moments I'd ignored, feelings I'd suppressed. The argument I'd had with my father the day before he passed. The friendship I let fade because I was too proud to apologize. The love I lost because I couldn't say the words she needed to hear. "I don't know," I whispered, though I knew that wasn't entirely true. "You do," the reflection said. "But it's not too late to face it. To change." As I stood there, staring at this version of myself, I realized the winter train wasn't just about hearing the stories of others. It was about finding the courage to confront my own. I stood frozen by the lake, my reflections' words echoing in my mind. The snow fell softly around me, a hushed witness to the weight of my thoughts. This journey, I realized, wasn't merely about listening to others. It was a mirror, forcing me to see what I'd buried within myself, unspoken regrets, unfinished conversations, and dreams left behind. The reflection of my past self stepped closer, his gaze steady and piercing. "You've spent years carrying the weight of yours, what ifs, haven't you?" he asked. "The apologies you didn't make, the people you let drift away." I nodded slowly, feeling the truth of his words sink in. "But what can I do now? The past is gone, and they're gone too." He smiled faintly, a mix of sadness and understanding. "The past may be unchangeable, but it doesn't have to hold you captive. You've heard their stories, Tom, Elena, the elderly woman. What have you learned?" I thought back to their words. Tom's regret had taught me the importance of letting go of pride before it's too late. Elena's story reminded me that guilt can be transformed into something meaningful. The elderly woman had shown me that love, even when lost, leaves behind a beauty that never truly fades. I've learned that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It means honoring the past while embracing the present, I said, my voice firm despite the lump in my throat. The reflection nodded. Exactly. This train, it's a bridge, not a destination. You're here to find peace, to choose what you'll carry with you and what you'll finally let go. The frozen lake shimmered, its surface rippling with images, my father's laughter, the friend I hadn't called in years, the woman I once loved. Each scene felt like a bittersweet gift, a reminder that these moments, though fleeting, had shaped me. You still have time, the reflection said, stepping back as the wind picked up, scattering snowflakes like tiny stars. Time to make amends. Time to be present. Time to live fully. The train's whistle pierced the quiet night, calling me back. I turned, glancing at the open doors where the warm glow of the carriage beckoned. As I stepped back inside, The passengers looked at me knowingly, their faces calm. The elderly woman offered a gentle nod, and Tom and Elena smiled faintly. They didn't need to ask what had happened. I could feel that they already knew. The train began to move again, its steady rhythm carrying us through the endless winter night. But now, the journey felt different. I felt lighter, as though I had left something heavy behind on that frozen lake. The conductor passed by, pausing to meet my gaze. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked. I nodded. "I think I did." He smiled knowingly. "Good. The winter train always takes you where you need to go." As the train disappeared into the horizon, I closed my eyes, feeling a quiet sense of peace. I didn't know where the train would take me next, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to find out.